Good evening. If we could get started and everybody could take their seats, please. I'm Barbie Zelizer, Director of the Scholars Program in Culture and Communication, and I want to thank you for coming tonight to our evening with Peter Dalhgren. Peter Dalhgren exemplifies one of the best examples of a global citizen pursuing global concerns. Drawing from sociology, political science, and cultural studies, Dalhgren has addressed the seemingly disparate but ultimately integrated sites of journalism, television, and new media in his ongoing consideration of what it means to be a political citizen in a global age. His personal travels certainly prepared him for this academic journey. Born in Sweden, he grew up in the States, hence the surprisingly familiar accent, earning his undergraduate degree from nearby Bucknell University and advanced degrees from Stockholm University, American University, and CUNY. No surprise, then, that his scholarship shines broadly and ranges widely. Calling himself a disciplinary hybrid, he has written prolifically on the establishment of meaningful practice in a contemporary media age. He is the author or editor of 10 books, one of which, Media and Civic Engagement, Citizens, Political Communication, and Democracy, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, produced over 80 articles and book chapters, 6 special journal issues, and participated in various collaborative programs sponsored by the EU and other institutions. Likewise, he has held appointments in Sweden, Stockholm, Scotland, France, Italy, South Africa, and Canada, and regularly lectures in Europe and the United States. He has a pragmatic side, too, having developed online doctoral courses on the internet, structured a high school course curriculum on the media which received the Swedish Ministry of Education's Book Prize, and consulted on internationalization and the media for universities in the UK and Sweden, the Social Science Research Council and Higher Education Funding Council in the UK, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the National Research Councils of Norway, Denmark, and Belgium. But tonight we have him here, in one place, where he has promised to speak on new media, young citizens, and civic cultures, participation, practices, and identities. Please join me in welcoming Peter Dalhgren.
Well, thank you, Barbie, for that overwhelming introduction. If I live up to it. And thank you all for coming, and I also want to express my thanks to the Annenberg School for the invitation to spend the semester here. It's a real delight and a privilege. What I'd like to do briefly in this presentation, somewhere in the middle actually, is talk about a project that we finished up recently in Sweden, and has now gone on to become more of a cooperative EU project. But I want to preface that with a kind of long scene-setting introduction, and I want to round it off with a longer, what should we call it, analytic payoff. So we'll see. I want to begin actually by introducing Sarah, or in English, Sarah. Sarah is 16 years old. She goes to high school in a small provincial Swedish town. She's engaged in alter globalization issues. During our interviews with her, she was a little shy but friendly, a little reticent. She defines herself as anti-fascist. She defines herself as a feminist. And let's see, okay, we can get on with the show here. Right. And she uses the internet a lot for her activities in the political realm. And so in the interviews, they ask, well, for example, what form has your activism taken? And she says, well, we're into ad busting, where we attack unethical commercials. We collect information about the company in question in order to make sure that we're right to criticize them. Then we, if it's perhaps a sexist advertisement, we stick on text stickers that say, for example, you can't buy me. But you have to be careful. You need to check on your facts. And if you get it wrong, it can be destructive for the whole organization. And so how does it work? And Sarah says, well, you can order them from a site on the net, and then you print out these stickers, and they have instructions about how you can go about it. But we're careful not to destroy anything. We're only trying to make people open their eyes. And so one can begin to ponder, what's going on here? What is this thing? What is Sarah into? And one might venture or speculate, well, she'll probably grow out of it. But what is it she's supposed to grow out of? Well, I can imagine maybe in 10 or 15 years, maybe she won't be an anti-fascist. In fact, in Sweden, there aren't that many certified fascists to begin with. But she'll probably still be feminist in some way, even if she isn't sticking stickers on sexist advertisements. But this thought that she'll grow out of it, implying that, oh, well, she'll probably settle down, join the Social Democratic Party or one of the bourgeois equivalents, become a voter and watch TV news every night as she's raising her 1.4 kids or whatever the statistic is. Maybe. I think, though, the odds are working against that particular model. So if we're going to pursue a little bit here, what's going on? Let's go to, well, some quick observations here about Sarah. She's not typical, she's not representative, obviously. In sociological terms, one could say that she and others who are thus politically engaged are, in a sense, deviants. There aren't that many of them, it seems. She's emblematic of a certain kind of trend here. She has democratic sensibilities. For her, these politics are personally meaningful. There's a lot of identity work going on here. Her politics go in a lot of different directions, sort of overlapping each other. It's not like this ideological precision. She's a civic agent, an engaged citizen, and the internet is very important for her. Now, if we take a few steps back and try to get an overview of what's going on here, we can contextualize Sarah in the discussions about the health of democracy, democracy's dilemmas and crises and so forth. Now, democracy obviously is a very complex enterprise and can't be reduced to any one particular factor, but I think generally one would argue that political participation, some involvement of the citizenry is at some level a bottom line. And this is one of the big worries across the world in the Western democracies, that civic participation, how you care to define it, generally seems in long-term perspective to be declining in terms of voting, in terms of party loyalties, in terms of participation even in civil society. And when we turn to the youth, young people, they manifest these trends with a vengeance, one might say, and are often particularly the target of, well, they're blamed, the situation is deplored, and so forth. And they manifest even less interest, trust, engagement, and so forth. However, there are alternative perspectives on this, and some analysts say, well, it's not so much maybe that the young have bailed out of democracy, but one can also see it that political elites, the system or whatever, have abandoned or in some ways perhaps even excluded the young, so that the young find much of sort of mainstream party politics not personally relevant, not interesting. However, this doesn't mean that there is no political engagement about the young, among the young, but rather it's found in other arenas. So research, and I'll be talking about research generally, and I'll be pulling from research not least from colleagues here at the school, but it shows that in the West, I mean, the young typically still affirm their support for democracy. And a lot, of course, depends on what kind of opportunities are made available. And for many, they feel that there isn't much in terms of situations where they feel they can make a difference. And as well known, often younger activists are drawn more to single-issue politics and so forth. If we can understand these trends by setting them even within even a broader horizon. And if we look at what some people call, I see a spelling error there, late modernity, where people, for example, note that, or observers note that the life course of young people are becoming what they call de-standardized. That became a T instead of a dash. Partly having to do with post-Fordist economies, when it has to be flexible, labor power, the direct connection between a particular education and a certain job is not so self-evident as it was perhaps when my generation left high school, and so forth. Other trends, sociologists note processes of individualization. People are skeptical, young people are skeptical towards large organizations. Again, these are trends. I mean, they're not solid black and white observations, but also resistance to traditional forms of authority. And sociologists have long noted, over several decades now, the decline of traditional institutions, family, school, church, etc., in terms of socializing young people, and some will claim that the media is increasingly filling those alleged voids, and identities then shaped by consumption, leisure, popular culture, and so on. All right, this is a kind of a quick take on late modern society, and leaves a lot of, I mean, it's really working with a 12-inch brush. But I think if we see these as trends and not sort of absolute realities, some of the problems of democracy, I think, become more easier to understand. So the social, cultural conditions or preconditions for democracy are in change. And in other words, it can't be business as usual because the circumstances are altered. And what happens then? Well, this is where we're like in the middle of things and are trying to make sense of a situation which is in transition. Now, in the wake of these changes, what we see then is that for many people involved in politics, particularly alternative politics, the boundaries between the political and the personal becoming more fluid. And some people, I have a colleague in London, David Buckingham, who's done a lot of work on children, the media, and politics, and he asserts very strongly that, I've sort of paraphrased him here, modern society has tended to equate politics with the public arena, and thus perhaps conveys a constricted notion of the political. And the political, we see among young people, the notion of the political is entering into everyday contexts, social relations, power, games, and so on. And a lot of young people, and I think here of the work of Kevin Barnhurst, researchers finding that young people don't automatically make the distinction between, say, information, entertainment that my generation has done. And I remember in Sweden when, let's see, it was called Robinson there, I think it's called Survivor here about 10 years ago, one of these first reality shows with, they're on, the desert island, and they're, these, they vote somebody out each week and so on. Well, my wife has 6 nieces, and back then they were about 22 to 25 years of age. And so when the program first came, it was a big debate and scandal in Sweden with public service broadcasting showing this stuff. And I did a kind of an academic reflex take on it and sort of scoffed. And they said, "But Peter, you don't understand." I said, "What? watching this program, it's informative. We learn about relationships, group dynamics. We learn about politics. And I had to go think about that for a while. I still do sometimes. But I mean, for me, this was indicative of something new in the way of looking at or defining politics, the political, and a way of even approaching the media. In other words, these different a priori categories are no longer necessarily valid. So, particularly now in this, with the media landscape where internet has been leading this technological revolution, and I use internet in a very broad sense. Some authors do also to encompass just about everything in terms of ICTs. But so-called Web 2.0, an enormous array of easily usable, accessible, cheap applications that can individualize your activities and link you up and help you process information, get involved in the world, network, and so forth. And increasingly we see, just in terms of hours, this is where particularly a lot of young people are hanging out. This is where they're spending a lot of time. And forms of knowledge and organizations, existing forms, are being challenged. They're being questioned, not always explicitly, but just de facto by the way people are learning new ways of interacting. Researchers find also, however, that in all this, young people often, again, this is an international comparison, lack detailed political knowledge, at least in a traditional sense. For those citizens who are engaged, the internet is, of course, very well. It just facilitates participation in ways unthinkable in the past, and we see this with the growth of networks. Now, some arguments, or some will argue that the internet is a kind of driving force and recruits people. I think that kind of technological determinism isn't very useful. But certainly, the internet is altering the way politics is getting done. And I think we see this most specifically with those involved in alternative politics, but even within party politics. Increasingly, the interactive mode of these technologies are being used. Now, in all this, the proximity of politics, consumption, popular culture that we see from the mass media is certainly reproduced on the net as well. And let's be clear, when we're talking about political uses of the net, it ranks really far down compared to other uses of the net. I saw some, I guess statistics are a bit older now, but some years ago, there was a book that they were analyzing websites and categorizing websites and political websites in terms of the whole array of possible websites from the sample they took. I don't know, somewhere between cooking and religion, and all the other kinds of shopping, information, entertainment, leisure, pornography, et cetera, comes first. In these debates, there's a historical irony here, perhaps, that it was specifically after the fall of the wall, the collapse of communism, that the West, particularly Washington, with this rhetoric of "Hooray, we won!" and now in the Eastern Europe we would just introduce market forces and have elections and everything would be splendid. It was a few years after that these concerns about democracy doesn't seem to be working so well began to gain ground and became sort of an international chorus. And about the same time, mid-90s, when the internet is becoming a sort of mass phenomena, that many armchair theorists put this together and say, problem, democracy not working well, new phenomenon, communication technology, the net, there we have the solution. And the easy optimism has, of course, gone in the suitable dustbin. The situation is that's complex, and certainly one can say at base the problems of democracy is not that we don't have enough keyboards or buttons, or the problems lie elsewhere. But certainly the revolution of the net is is altering the conditions for democracy, and I think that's important to understand. It's not. There are no guarantees here, but it's like we just can't go back. We can only go forward, and what that road looks like is still a bit unclear. Now, let me get into this study that we did. We did interviews with two groups of young activists, 25 in each. We call them the parliamentarians and the alternatives. The parliamentarians, in Sweden, all the established parliamentary political groups have youth, or parties that have youth groups, which are sort of training grounds for future party members and the political elite. And so we had young activists from, I think, 4 of the 5 or 6 major political parties. And among the alternatives, we have people who were active in alter globalization, feminist, environmental movements, and animal rights. And I should say that we selected these people not in any way to gain a representative sample. On the contrary, we selected them because they were active, they were highly computer hip, very skilled in using the internet, and we wanted to see, well, what do people like this do with the internet? So we studied to see the role played by the internet in the context of their activism. Now, we found that both groups use the net. Obviously, they use the net for keeping up on current affairs and so forth. Both groups, we see a lot of learning going on. They're always discovering new things. They learn new things about the net. They learn how to use it, but also they're learning about its applications in organizational work, networking, communicating with each other, and so forth. We found in these interviews that for them there's no particular division between the net and the so-called in real life. They use the net to organize meetings where they encounter each other face to face. So it's not like sitting in front of the screen is some kind of a particular ontological state removed from other kind of realities. They both shape the net and related technologies for their own needs, doing lists, setting up teleconferencing, whatever it might be. And they're, again, very skilled and innovative in this regard. They use the net as internal public spheres for discussing, the parliamentarians tended more to discuss issues. The alternatives tend to use it more for sort of bonding, or collective identity. Yet, despite these similarities, they are generating 2 different kinds of civic cultures. So, first of all, the parliamentarians are operating in a much more established political context. They use the mass media to define essentially their political realities. The mass media for them are an expression of the legitimate political domain, that terrain on which they operate. So the net is used to complement this. Of course, they will get much of the mass media on the net as well, newspapers and news bureaus and so forth. But the net then follows up. It's a complement to the world of mass media, mainstream politics, and they will use and they actually follow the mass media very intently. And one fellow says, well, I watch TV news a lot, not for the information. I can get that more effectively on the net, actually. But I find it's useful to watch how they argue, how the politicians, our party people, how they handle the journalists. And so I try to learn debate tactics and so forth. This is coming like from a 17-year-old. Right? These are kids. And listening to them talk. They would have this kind of adult hat on and talk about their political stuff, and then the hat would glide off, and they would become kids again. It's kind of shuttling back and forth. So their net use, in a way, helps solidify their identities and their political horizons in mainstream politics. Now, for the alternatives, they're in a very different situation. They have no real institutionalized base. Their situation is unstable. They view the mass media with great suspicion, to say the least. They feel that the media generally do not cover the issues that they themselves are interested in, or if they do, they don't cover them very well. And often, many of them will say they've been present at sort of activities, demonstrations, or whatever, and feel that the reports that came out afterward were distorted. And so they have a lot of frustration with the media and see it often as part of the problem. So for them, the net becomes a source of alternative information, alternative views. On the net, they can even find critiques of what the mainstream media are doing. Also, many of them, now I don't know if this has to do with our selection, but it seems like the alternatives tended to be more geographically dispersed. And for them, the net was really important. It was a lifeline, really, to keep in touch with each other, even just socially. And so there was a lot of even just socializing going on among this group in terms of the net. The vegetarians were exchanging recipes, and the others were exchanging experiences and talking about their travels. And I was at a great demonstration last summer. And, it was the political and the non-political really would glide in and out. There was a very porous boundary. And so for them, the net provides possibilities for group cohesion, and they do a lot of identity work. As we saw with Sarah here in the earlier, for her, she's really working hard on who she is, and she's doing it with the help of the net and through her political engagement. Now, while we were analyzing the interviews and thinking about this, we were also trying to develop some conceptual horizons. And so we shuttled back and forth between essentially the theoretical and the empirical. And civic cultures becomes it's a framework to try to grasp some of the factors that can help or that might impede civic agency of people acting as citizens. And if we think of cultures generally, practices and meaning and patterns of communication, and cultures are taken for granted. They offer orientations for daily life, for collective activity, and they're shared. They have kind of an intersubjective character. And we can also see them as resources. Cultures, civic cultures, and in particular having to do with citizenship, are something that people can make use of. And in their activities, in their practices, they in turn contribute to the further development of the specific civic cultures. And I keep using civic cultures in the plural, on the one hand to differentiate myself from the tradition of Almond and Verba, which is a different school of thought, but also to underscore that civic cultures are indeed plural. There are many ways of doing citizenship, many ways of being engaged, and we see lots of different versions. And the two that we had in our study here are only two of innumerable possibilities, even in relatively small Sweden. Civic cultures, then, as a resource, I see them as both strong. They can empower people, but they're also vulnerable. They are shaped by the power relations of society. Civic cultures can be, they feel the impact of power, economics, social class, etc. Civic cultures are in some ways easy to destroy, yet they can be very strong. They can blossom under the surface. And we saw, for example, then in before the collapse of communism, forms of civic culture which were viable in Eastern Europe. The notion of civic culture is both normative. It says, well, what is needed? We need this, this, and this, and I'll get to that in a moment. And it's also empirical. It offers points of entry for looking specifically at particular elements. And if civic cultures are shaped by many factors, not least the media, and this is, of course, my own particular take on it, and we can then look at the media, ask questions of it, and try to ascertain in what way is it helping or hindering civic cultures. Now, I modeled it as 6 dimensions here. The ones on the left are pretty familiar from political communication, political science, although we should keep in mind that knowledge can take many forms in late modern society. And my wife and I noticed that our young sons have very different modes of gathering and dealing with knowledge than we do. They're multimedial, and we tend to be linear, textual, one thing at a time in our abilities. On the right, let me just quickly say that also in terms of values, support loyalty for democratic values, substantive ones, but even procedural ones, things like turn-taking, reciprocity, and so forth. Trust, this is often heralded as a good thing, but let's also keep in mind that too much trust is not a good thing. There's optimal trust. And trust in a horizontal sense. Trust, there needs to be sufficient trust that you will link up with a stranger in a common cause. That somebody on the net approaches you and say, you want to join us in this action or in this, around this issue. That you trust them sufficiently to do that. We've seen in situations the absence of trust. We see, for example, in the horrors in the wake of the Balkan Wars, people sitting in the same coupe in the train not daring to open their mouth because the accent will reveal ethnic belonging, and not trusting this with the stranger. So again, the vulnerability. Now, on the right side, these come more from cultural theory. Spaces that can give access to communicative spaces that can give access to other people, other citizens, vertically, and also spaces that will give access horizontally and vertically, so that there's somewhere to go with your engagement. And practices and skills, let me go into these in a little bit more detail. And practices and identity. So I'll see. I should start thinking about the time a little bit. Just very quickly on knowledge. Knowledge is, on one hand, again, self-evident, and we're seeing plural forms of knowledge. And I think this becomes significant in the context of political communication. How do you reach citizens? Well, it depends on the groups. The strategies will have to vary, and the target audiences, the modes of expression will, of course, have to be adjusted. Values, trust. Spaces, both face-to-face and mediated spaces are required. In our interviews, these young citizens talked about getting together, meeting each other, talking about politics, and yet using the net. They see no contradiction, no real distinction in a sense in terms of quality of interaction. Whose space is it? Well, one of the great things about the net is that you can make it your space. It's moldable, it's adaptable. And new spaces, you can open up new spaces, you can open up new websites, you can open up new links, set up networks, and so forth. So the spaces then become very central, and I think this is why, say, for civic cultures, the net is such a key phenomena for the alternative political movements. Now, practices. Here, I think we get to the key, because practices are important because democracy, or it needs democratic thought, but you can't just go around thinking democratic, nice thoughts. It requires some kind of a doing, even in the sense of communicating is a doing. Communicative skills are required. These are developed through experience. It's through practice that the sense of agency becomes embodied, is made real. It's how people become empowered. Now, often democratic practice, we are offered voting as the paradigmatic civic act, and in one sense it is. But if we look beyond voting, to begin with, civic talking. One can make the analogy with the church. How's it go? If two people gather in my name, says the church is there present. Well, if two citizens gather and talk politics, well, democracy or the public sphere is present. And so the skills of communication here become important, because the other kinds of practices, such as debating, negotiating, mobilizing, etc., become relevant. These, and I can call them kids, were very much in the process of developing these capacities. And over time, practices, they become a kind of tradition of our group, our political community. Tradition can shape collective memories. Traditions then become something that you can draw on. It becomes part of the taken for granted of the civic cultures. We come back to identities, people's sense of themselves as citizens. Now, very few people would find the word, and I think in English citizen, in French citoyen, and Swedish medborgare, in none of these contexts does the word itself tend to get people's adrenaline going. It's not like you wake up in the morning, oh, I'm feeling really civic today, I'm going to be a citizen. Rather, it's a case of, do you feel connected to some political community? Do you feel that you can make some kind of difference through your action? Does it seem meaningful? And so if we think of these different dimensions, instead of seeing them as a list, I model them in my mind as, I don't know if you remember in high school physics, the atom, we have the neutrons and protons zipping around. Well, I see these dimensions functioning very much like that. They are in reciprocal relationship to each other. So the more knowledge you have, that'll enhance your trust, perhaps. It'll impact on your practices, reinforcing your identities, et cetera, and it goes around. Now, for your identities to be operative, you need a sense of political community, a we feeling. This could be short-term around a particular issue, or it could be long-term and more sustained ideological, concerted political enterprise. So knowledge, practices, and skills, along with the use of spaces, solidifies identity. And in this, then, the role of the media become very paramount. You can analyze, say, television news, you can look at newspaper practices and see, well, in what ways do they contribute to knowledge? What kind of knowledge? About what? Do they encourage support for democratic values? Sometimes values are mobilized, say, in the case of scandals. It was a violation of our the value of honesty or whatever. Does television news increase your trust, or does it reduce your trust? Does it make you feel, does it strengthen your sense of efficacy as a citizen or not? Well, in none of these cases is the answer a simple yes or no. It depends on what does the material look like, what is the context, and so forth. But my sense is then, though, that we are, as a result of the interviews, we find that these dimensions open up the promise for fruitful media analysis as well, not only in dealing with the citizens themselves. So, to wrap up then, we're in a process of change. Adaptation and evolution are taking place. In this setting, the internet can, in some ways, very complex, facilitate political engagement, although it's never by itself mobilizes anything. It's a question of how it's used. To the extent it does this, it goes via civic cultures. The internet, in conjunction with the rest of the media landscape, and with the larger sociocultural changes taking place in late modernity. And looking ahead, will this be fruitful or not? Will it go anywhere? We can't be sure. A lot, I think, also depends on what versions of democracy one is working with. I think all too often democracy can become a kind of incantation and a mantra. And there are, in fact, it's a contested notion. There are different versions of it operating in the world. There are different models proposed theoretically. And I think sometimes it can be useful to reflect on that. But anyhow, I think it's clear that these trends aren't going to be reversed. We aren't going to be able to go back to a situation as it was in a previous time. They're going to intensify. They open up new ways to think about politics, about democracy, about engagement. And we'll see in a few years, or in many years, when we look back, we'll see if what we're experiencing today, if this was indeed significant for the future of democracy. So I'll stop there, and thanks for your attention.